Zombies bosses ranked worst to best. The Abomination in Liberty Falls. This feels kind of criminal to put last on my list, but as much as I love Black Ops 6 Zombies, this particular boss fight just doesn't hit the mark. The boss itself is just a reused enemy type, and there's no changes made to it. The arena is exactly the same as it is when you're playing the regular map. The story implications don't feel grandiose, it doesn't feel like you're pulled into the narrative, and you can basically auto-complete the boss fight just by sucking Etherella. And so even compared to some of the worst boss fights on this list, I still think this actually comes in lower than those, so that's why I've placed it here. The Zetsubo tree boss. This is by far the weakest boss fight in BO3, and I mean, to be honest, it's probably the weakest boss fight in CoD Zombies history, and it also somehow isn't even the most exciting boss fight on Zetsubo. Like, that spider boss is kind of crazy, but the tree guy is barely even involved when you fight it. It just sits there until a weak spot's exposed, and then you have to shoot it with the KT-4. Beyond that, yeah, you need to avoid lots of thrashers and spiders, which isn't too bad, although I guess thrashers can be a bit annoying at times, but there really isn't much stopping you from just running in circles around them and taking them out with the best weapons in the game. And on top of all that, I hate to be the one to say this, but I think the boss fight arena is kind of boring too. The Order on Firebase Z. This is one of the easier boss fights of all time, I would say. It's pretty underwhelming if you know what you're doing, but it does at least feel more like a boss fight than whatever we just discussed on Zetsubo. And part of that comes from the fact that there is a mechanic where the Order takes less damage from attacks until his mouth hole thing starts glowing. But once it is glowing, you can just pour damage into that bad boy for critical hits. And if you pair those crits with a well-timed ring of fire, you can kill this dude in like 10 seconds flat. And that makes it pretty underwhelming, I would say. Dead of the Night's Werewolf. So on Dead of the Night, you remember the big guy that basically chased and annoyed you the entire game leading up to the boss fight? Well, I've got good news for you. You get to fight a more annoying and more big version. Crazy that, isn't it? And if that wasn't frustrating enough, this big bad werewolf decides to be invisible for most of the actual boss fight. And to get him to appear, you have to rotate a few lights until they turn green. And then once they're green, the werewolf gets stun locked and is then able to take damage. But after you do enough damage, he goes back into hiding, and then more werewolves spawn? Like, give me a break, please. Thankfully, they're just the normal Jawns that we've fought through the game, so you take those out, and then you just have to repeat the whole thing all over again. And I think Treyarch hoped that by making the invisible werewolf sometimes attack you, they'd add to the sort of excitement of the fight, but it just doesn't end up as engaging as most of the other boss fights on this list. Tag to Toten's Circle of Death. Is it fair for me to call air itself a boss, guys? You let me know in the comments down below. I'm sure there'll be some folks down there that say, hey, this isn't a real boss fight. There isn't a singular enemy we're taking down. It's just oxygen. But honestly, when was the last time you saw oxygen act in such a boss-like manner?
Oh my god. Damn, that's intense.
First of all, the oxygen is present during the last step of the Easter egg, right? Second of all, there is a specific zone of safety. It's a circle of death that moves, and at points you are forced to collect souls as well. The oxygen very much does not like you if you step outside of that circle of safety, and once you beat the little oxygen challenge here, don't know why I'm calling it an oxygen challenge, it's just a circle of death, but once you do that, the entire map changes into this lava hellscape thing until the game ends shortly after. So don't get me wrong, it's mid. Like, I don't want to talk it up too much here, but I still think that there's boss fightiness about it. And unfortunately, it just makes me wish even more that we'd seen an actual boss inside that kind of boss arena challenge thing. Like, Tag really deserved better.
Oh, mama! No, legit like mama.
That's right, we're kicking out the old Mama Magua, and Mama Spider is in its place now. And for good reason. I think that this boss fight is the better of the two bosses on Zetsubo. It's only accessible after you build the KT-4, which you use to clear this web to slide down into the arena itself, so it's got a quite cool Indiana Jonesy almost entry into it, and then you're greeted by your new surrogate mother, and you have to shoot the spider in the yellowish part of its mouth to do any damage, and it actually does pretty decent damage to you as well. On top of that, if you take a long time taking Mother down, it'll spawn extra spiders and can trap the player within its web. And so overall, it's got better mechanics than many other Easter egg bosses. The only thing that makes it a little bit more of a cakewalk is that it doesn't have that much health and it can be killed fairly quickly if you're prepared. But if they just 10x'd the health on this thing, this would be an intense fight. So Mother scores points for that. The Act 3 Octopus Worm. Possibly the biggest surprise of Modern Warfare Zombies was the first Purple Worm boss fight. During the final mission of the Act 3 story, the player is taken completely by surprise when this oversized worm jumps out of the ground and eats a helicopter that we were tasked with destroying ourselves just seconds earlier. The worm only has a few attacks, so it can shoot a laser from its mouth, it eats the player and spits them out, it does ground smashes, and it can also go underground as well. And this one has a really warm spot in my heart because I was the first person to ever take this worm down, and Treyarch were actually in the chat watching me as I did it. And so that felt really nice, but admittedly, it isn't the hardest fight. It just has a lot of sort of epic surprise factor to it. And when it brings the community together in the way that it did that day, I think that shouldn't be ignored. And if you were there in the chat, or you just feel like giving me some support for grinding through a 48-hour stream to get that boss fight taken down, drop a like on the video. That would be amazing. Thanks. Alpha Omega's Avagadro. The Avagadro has a history of really cool summoning animations going all the way back to turning on the power in transit, right? And seeing him emerge from the whatever the hell it's called pyramid thing in Alpha Omega is pretty similar. It's really damn cool. Also, the fight is kind of unique in that it's all underground, and most of the other boss arenas on our list are actual arenas, whereas Alpha Omega said, nah, we're just going to use the entire bunker, which is part of the map itself, for the fight. It's also pretty cool because the zombies that you fight in it are mannequins, which is obviously fitting for the Nuketown location, but a lot of the boss is mostly focused on not the boss. You're just taking out zombies and running around, and for that, I'd say that it kind of loses some points compared to some of the other boss fights where the boss is a real lean, mean boss machine, whatever the hell that means. Forsaken's Forsaken. So this one's hard to rank, right? It's nearly impossible to fail once you make it to the boss arena, and so the challenge here is certainly not what is scoring it points, but it does have a really significant cool factor, especially since we're fighting alongside this super powerful version of Samantha. And I can't lie, the visuals overall are spectacular. Sophia's trapped in that big box. That's freaking awesome. The Forsaken is large, and there's just so many effects happening everywhere, and it's a really spectacular fight, I would say. However, the boss fight itself mechanically is still a little underwhelming. Reason being, over the prior 12 months leading up to that fight, we'd been getting so much world building and information about the idea of this Forsaken, right? This dark ether entity that seemed so powerful and terrifying. But then you get into the boss fight with it, and it's barely a threat, really, compared to the zombies themselves during the battle. And all you've got to do is break the Forsaken's shield by shooting it for a few seconds with the Chrysalax gun, and that doesn't seem that epic, right? And then you collect some souls underneath Samantha to charge the big laser cannon, and the cannon then takes out a third of the Forsaken's health if you shoot a weak spot. And it kind of just makes me feel like, wow, okay, we heard all this crazy stuff about the Dark Ether, but either the stuff in the Dark Ether is just kind of weak and not that scary, or we're so absurdly powerful that it's actually comedy that we even worried about this stuff in the first place. So yeah, I think that a fight like this really should have been a bit more challenging, and it would have ranked higher as a result if it was. Blood of the Dead's Warden. There's a lot of sucking you have to do on Blood of the Dead, and by that I mean sucking zombie souls with this key to charge your shield, obviously. And then once your shield is charged, you have to shield blast the central orb thing, but if you lose your shield, you're totally screwed because you have to be able to shield blast to progress the boss fight. And sure, they make it a little easier for you by giving you regular carpenters, but even so, there's some real risk there. And also, I should mention, the arena itself is also pretty exciting. It's small, it's thematic, I like the vibes. The machine in the middle is pretty damn ominous, and it feels like things are happening like all the time with hellhounds and wardens spawning and all sorts of stuff like that. But all of that said, there's no real main boss here. There's just big warden boy, and the mechanics aren't earth-shattering, so it's a mixed one, I would say. The story implications and the cutscene from the fight, some of the most crazy, memorable stuff in zombies history ever. But mechanically, it's certainly not a revolution in what's possible for boss fights. It's just kind of yet another encounter. The machine's Olov protection. So I would have called this the Olov boss fight, but Olov isn't really the boss. Like, the boss is kind of the time that you're taking to do it. It's a weird one. It's a very easy fight, perhaps actually the most easy in Zombies history, but it's also, I think, pretty energizing in the moment. Like, Cold War is the first Zombies game to remove movement restrictions, meaning you can mantle and jump freely over anything on the map, and this arena is perfect for showing how fun it can be killing hordes of zombies while running around like a madman protecting our little buddy here. So in that regard, the constraints that they add in the fight itself to amp up the stakes make it much more enjoyable. And it's then pretty cool, the whole idea that once Olov is done doing his thing, he stays back and holds things down while Strike Team runs through to the exfil chopper, and that makes the boss fight almost something melancholic in a sense. And I really appreciate when a boss fight moves me emotionally in some way, however big or small. So in that regard, great intro to Cold War, lots of fun to complete, good for newer players who might be playing the on-disc map of Cold War to give them a kind of appetite for more of this stuff in the future. It's just that it gets to a point where it's so easy that people might do it a bit too straightforwardly and then not necessarily have something to grind for while waiting for future DLC maps. So again, somewhat mixed, kind of weird to call it a boss fight, but still a good time. Revelations Shadowman. This one is really complex for me because on the one hand, the fact that this boss fight was blue screening as much as it was when the game came out meant that I sort of hated it automatically. And I really clearly remember my team and several other teams would be first in the race to get the Easter egg done, and then we would crash and another team would go into first and then they would crash, and it was just pure chaos. And that does affect a memory of a fight, but if I look at it now, irrespective of what the experience was on day one, I actually think that this fight is really cool. I think that the arena aesthetically is phenomenal. It's so interesting. And I challenge you, if you go into the game here, do the Easter egg, get into the arena, and just look around at the way that the rock is carved in the ceiling, for example. It just gives the flavor of there being something more, some kind of greater meaning that we're not fully understanding yet. And I love that. I think that that's a really important feature for boss fights. Now, I will say it's pretty easy, and historically people have complained a lot about the fact that it's meant to be this massive culmination of storyline, and it's kind of over before you even know it, and that is a problem, and it creates ludonarrative dissonance where you are expecting the story to be at a real climax, whereas the gameplay doesn't really give you that climactic moment. But even so, this one still holds a special place in my heart, and that's why it has this position on this list. The Modern Warfare 3 Zombies Grey Lorm, or Red Worm. At launch for this game, this was the hardest boss in Modern Warfare 3 Zombies, and while that did change towards the end of the game, which we'll talk about later, it's still pretty damn difficult to this day. And it has the same moves as the Purple Worm that we talked about before, but the stakes are so much higher. You have to wait for the game timer to expire, and while you're waiting for it to expire, do a whole bunch of collecting USB sticks, and then once that happens, the gas starts to expand, and the game starts another much shorter timer, right? That final 15 minutes. And that means that you have a timer for the boss fight itself, and if you bail, you're going to have a much smaller zone of map which you can actually move through in order to still manage to exfil. On top of that, if your gas mask breaks, you're probably going to die. If you don't kill the boss in time, you're going to die. And if you have the wrong weapons going into it, you're probably not going to be able to kill some of the other stuff that's there trying to take you down the entire time, and you're also going to die. And you've probably kept really good loot for the fight itself, and so if you die, the stakes are really high because you don't want to lose all that stuff. And all those things mean that it's a really fun challenge, and I'd say it's kind of different to almost all other bosses in CoD Zombies history, and it definitely scores points for that. Shadows of Evil's Shadowman. Before Shadows of Evil, there were no boss fights, which is really crazy to think about. Like, okay, yeah, Black Ops 2, where are the bosses, bro? Sure, they experimented with special zombies on previous maps, but there hadn't ever been a fully sequenced fight before 2015. And for Treyarch's first rodeo, it's pretty interesting, right? It's easy and hard. It's easy to complete, but also really easy to fail it. To do it right, you just have to shoot the Shadowman enough to force him to the top of the altar, and then once he's there, you can capture him with the summoning key. but if you miss your shots, you're standing in the wrong place, you've got the wrong weapons, you're not coordinated with your team, you're getting beaten up by a Margwa, all those things might mean that you fail and you end up having to retry. And once you fail, also, it only gets harder because other Margwas are going to spawn in, they're going to take you down if you're not careful, and there are the gaps in the floor, so you can just fall off the world. And all those things in combination mean it's a great arena, I would say, and it's a decent challenge, even though it is extremely quick. And I'm willing to bet that most teams don't complete this properly on their first go round. And for that reason, it scores points. That's, in my view, one of the primary goals of a boss fight. So Shadows did pretty well for us there. Mauer Toten's Valentina. I'm of the opinion that Mauer is actually low-key one of the best zombies maps, and the boss fight is no different. You are face-to-face with Valentina, the daughter of Dr. Ulrich Vogel, and that in itself was a really cool reveal during this map. Learning more about Valentina and how she had kind of been manipulated by the Forsaken via her memory of Dr. Ulrich Vogel, like, that was cool, man. And the fight itself also takes you on a little tour of the map. You move from different spots, and that means that you have to constantly reevaluate your strategy in these new locations. And while you're doing that reevaluation, you've got to deal damage to her after breaking her bubble shield. But while she's inside the bubble, special zombies and normal zombies are going to be spawning in and attacking you from all directions, and it makes the fight feel really intense. On top of that, she has an attack that can kill you in one hit if you're in her line of sight, and that's a big deal. I love wipe mechanics of that style in zombies because they really make the stakes just maximized at all times. You have to really pay attention, and eventually you lead her back into the underground where the fight began, and you finish the fight there. But then it's not over because you have to escort Klaus into the back of the reactor, protecting him from all the zombies, and that's a really awesome experience for the player. Even if it's not necessarily the hardest thing in the world, it still just feels like you're really doing something meaningful. It advances the story with your actions in that moment. We're not just fighting a big creature for the sake of it, we've got perfect ludonarrative harmony in that we have to defend Klaus in order to achieve the objective here. Like, it's so cool. So overall, yeah, it's an epic fight, ticks a lot of boxes. Good job, Mauer Toten. 9's Elephants. This is one of the largest boss arenas we've ever seen, and it's to the point that it is maybe actually a bit too large. Like, there's just so much space in that arena, but still, it's one of the coolest, most unique, and memorable fights in CoD Zombies history, especially for me, because Black Ops 4 had just come out. I'd been grinding the game non-stop trying to pump out videos for you guys, and then I jumped in a match with Smart Guy. I think it was my second time ever playing 9, and somehow I managed to crack the code on one of the steps the whole community had been stuck on, and then we got into the boss fight the first time anyone had ever seen it.
I think the riders are using it to control the elephant.
What?
Elephants?
Excuse me?
What?
Oh my goodness!
What the?
Zombie elephant!
I was shaking from the adrenaline, and the whole community witnessed us taking it down for the first time ever together. It was an incredible community moment. Like, sure, earlier on I mentioned doing the Purple Worm first. We only had, what, like 3,000 viewers or something for Purple Worm? We had 33K for this fight. It was so epic, and the surprise of it all was just glorious. And also just thematically, from an art direction perspective, the fact that we're fighting a giant war elephant, insane. So cool. And sure, it's a little easier compared to some of the other boss fights on this list, but regardless, I love this one, and I'm not sorry that I've ranked it where I have. I think it's fantastic. Ancient Evil's Pegasus. Similar to Shadows of Evil, the Ancient Evil boss fight is unforgiving in that you can fall off a ledge at any point, and eventually entire sections of the boss fight just blow up and disappear, so you have to kind of hope you're one of the lucky ones standing on top of solid ground when that happens. Now, one thing I don't like so much about this fight is that you're kind of forced into using the Hellion Salvo if you want to do the most damage to Pegasus, since it's a flying boss. But honestly, I kind of think that's cool. Like, as much as it limits your options, most boss fights in zombies are just on the ground, and so mixing it up and forcing you to customize your loadout to suit the boss itself is kind of a good thing in its own way. Now, once you do enough damage to Pegasus, it falls from the sky onto one of the platforms, and you can then deal damage to it. But then after the Pegasus tragically dies to the Warlord on his high ground in the middle, you then have to kill the Warlord. And so overall, you've got a multi-stage fight in a really cool arena. It's thematically epic, and it's got challenge to it, and all those things come together to make a pretty good boss fight. Voyage of Despair's Eyeball. I suspect some of you are going to think I'm crazy for putting Voyage of Despair on this list this high, because Voyage is a map that brings despair to many people. But hear me out, okay? This is my thesis. It's as follows. It's a massive eyeball. Like, beyond anything else, isn't that kind of cool, dude? Just fighting a big ol' eye. I think it's pretty great. And to its credit also, the eyeball is a constant threat, even when you're not facing it directly.
Whoa! Did we do it? Hold on. Wait.
And it crashed.
Where's the controller? Old trusty.
There's a point in the fight where you've got to survive in little tiny rooms and it's beaming its light right at you, but the catch is that the eye becomes exposed when firing the beam, so you have to risk it all in order to damage it, and the kind of risk reward of that, I suppose, is really enticing. It's just a fun mechanic. And on top of all the beaming that's happening, there's the constant special zombie and normal zombie threat that you've got to deal with. And so for a boss fight that comes at the end of an Easter egg that's been really tedious and just honestly frustrating for many people, having an experience where it does feel really thematically unique and you feel like the mechanics sort of suit what's happening in front of you, it kind of makes it worth it for me. But leave a comment if you think I'm crazy here. Gorod Krovi's Dragon and Nikolai. Gorod is one of those maps where I still get messages to this day being like, Milo, I'm struggling on Gorod Krovi. Do you think you could actually join my game and help me out, please? And that's understandable because this fight is hard, man. You start off fighting a dragon and that's sick. From an aesthetic art direction perspective, it lights the arena on fire. You gotta whip out a shield to avoid taking damage. It's just freaking cool and it's fun. Also, you shoot into it and the way that it takes damage, the animation that you see, the kind of goop spewing out of it, like, oh my god, you feel so epic taking that dragon down. And then you do that and you think, oh yeah, I'm sick. Mission accomplished. Nay, Nikolai decides he's had enough. He's gonna turn on the team, and it's even more of a bait and switch because this isn't just some random NPC that's been helping us and is now turning against us. It's Nikolai. Not only is it Nikolai, it's a Nikolai we actually played as like 5 years prior. It's so cool that that's how they brought Nikolai into the story here, compared to what we saw with Takio in Zetsubo and Dempsey in DE, because that was a passive inclusion of those characters, whereas Nikolai just goes all out, dude. And it's a challenge, taking him down, like he is ferocious. So the combination of the fight being difficult, it's epic, it's got 2 phases, 2 bosses, distinct designs, unlike the 9 repeat of the elephants, and it plays with our hearts because we have to take down our drunk buddy. Like, that's a recipe for victory, right? That's a good-ass boss fight, so it gets a high spot on the list. Outbreak's Legion. I think there's an argument to be made for the Outbreak Legion boss fight to be the hardest in Zombies history. You are forced to start it on a late round, like you have to deal with super sprinters as you're dealing damage to the boss. And before you can even deal damage to the boss, you have to hit the boss's shield enough to stun him. And then after that, 3 orbs will circle him that you can then damage. And if you don't manage to do that, you're not going to be able to get a damage phase on the boss itself. And you fail 1 or maybe 2 of those phases, and you're just not going to have enough time in the 10-minute fight window to actually take the boss down. And that timer is really very stressful when you're sitting there trying to shoot those little orbs and you see the time ticking and ticking and ticking. You are going to be sweating by the end of the fight. And on top of all those things, the animations are sick. You exit the elevator from the bunker and surprise, there's this huge storm forming above you. And then there's this big explosion as he spawns in, and he's enormous, obviously. It's pretty awesome if you ask me. I think Outbreak has an incredible boss fight in Legion. Now, I know for a fact that a dozen of you clowns in the comments section are already tapping on your keyboard going, hold on, MrRoflWaffles, how is Modern Warfare Zombies this high up the list? That's unacceptable. Are you high, sir? Like, did you wake up on the wrong side of the bed, on the wrong side of the planet today? Like, what's going on? Listen, okay, just hear me out for 10 seconds. You're just wrong if you think this is a bad boss fight. This is an incredibly cool fight. And I know that, yes, it does lose some points from the fact that while fighting the entity, you're replating every 5 seconds. Like, that is absolutely a negative of the fight that also happens to pervade through the entire game. But there are so many good things about this fight that it actually kind of gets past a lot of those negatives. So, for instance, you're bouncing between different little worlds, okay? Sort of similar to what we saw in Ancient Evil, let's say. But in this incarnation of it, the boss is massive. It's this weird nebulous dark ether thing in an interesting way, which is kind of rare actually as well, so I kind of think it gains points there too. And then as you jump between those islands, the boss is doing all sorts of different attacks. There's a whole sort of variety to its arsenal there that you have to deal with, you have to contend with. The zombies are just coming at you like crazy, so there's an actual skill check present here. Like, you really can fail this if you're not coordinated and you're not working together with your team. And there's a secret version of the boss fight, like a secret Easter egg version of the fight, which gives you dedicated rewards just for doing it, which are separate to the general completion. That's cool too. It then leads directly into genuinely a pretty cool cutscene, and in contrast to everything else that came before it in Modern Warfare Zombies, it's a ton of fun. So yeah, fight me, leave a comment, do what you must. But I think this is one of the best boss fights we've ever seen. Does this one even need introducing? The Keeper on Der Eisendrache was truly the first real boss. Yeah, we had shadows, but I mean, maybe that doesn't count, right? And it's crazy because even so early in Treyarch's boss fight history, they smashed it out of the park. And for that reason, for many of you guys listening, this is probably your favorite boss fight of all time. It's got really in-depth mechanics. You're constantly forced to move around the arena. There's a lot to learn about it, to optimize and get better at the boss fight. And the arena design itself is so epic and feels so mysterious and really is a climax to the Easter egg. And in hindsight now, it's so nostalgic, but I actually don't think it's perfect, because as much as it felt at the time like it was Destiny level in terms of boss fight design, I actually think the next one on our list here just does everything a teeny tiny bit better if you take the nostalgia goggles off. Patient 13 in Terminus. I think this might be a bit controversial putting this at number 1, and it's tricky comparing it with DE, because I think that the DE arena, for example, is cooler. And I also think the surprise of getting to the DE boss fight and not knowing that was even gonna be there was also much cooler compared to Patient 13, which was kind of spoiled in advance by Treyarch's own marketing. Then there's a lot of other things that are very similar. So for example, both maps have wipe mechanics, and both those wipe mechanics have cool ways you can interrupt them. Also, both bosses are massive, and both bosses are not easy either. Like, they take some skill to be able to complete those fights. However, Patient 13 has a broader moveset, and in the P13 boss fight, the boss itself is more of a threat compared to in the DE boss fight, where it's much more so the panzers that are going to take you down. Then also, to balance the fact that the DE arena is cooler, I think that the music in the Patient 13 boss is significantly cooler than it is in DE. I think the music in Black Ops 6 is incredible, and it really takes it up a notch when you're fighting that massive squid and that music is just blasting in your ears. On top of that, I think that the P13 fight gives you a better sense of scale because you've got all those tentacles in the distance, and it has a cutscene both beforehand as you get into the fight and afterwards, which does also contribute to how epic the boss fight feels. And you can choose that continue playing option after P13, and then you get a free ray gun and a bunch of other rewards and Perkaholic to really juice up the remainder of your game. And it's got extra layers because there's Dark Ops to do it at even higher rounds and in shorter amounts of time, which just means that there's even more ways for you to express yourself as a player and make this fight harder in a way that you're actually rewarded for, which I do think makes the fight more epic overall when all things are considered. Now, the one thing that I think that Patient 13 could really improve on is the emotional factor. I don't think it really nails it in terms of you caring about the boss that you're fighting. It just feels like, oh, okay, there's a squid, whatever. But this doesn't go for all boss fights by any means. I mean, some bosses over the years and some Easter egg endings have actually made me cry, and that's happened multiple times. So if you want to check out some of my first boss fight reactions ever and see which ones did affect me in that way, then all you gotta do is click the link on screen now, and if you click through, you'll see me seeing all these bosses for the first time ever and what my genuine reaction was each and every time. I'll see you there.